Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones nobody can see. Sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is admit he's broken. In the village of Draugstad, Torsten the Fell-Handed sat in his wheeled chair every day. Everyone knew his legs were useless from the great battle 5 winters ago. The once mighty warrior now lived in silence and shame. People walked past his home quickly, whispering about curses and defeat. Then young Alfrid came to care for him. She watched how his strong arms moved the chair. She noticed how carefully he placed his legs. She saw moments when he forgot to act helpless. This wasn't the broken man everyone believed him to be. What was this giant Viking really hiding, and why would he choose to live a lie? Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story moves you, subscribe. Tomorrow brings something truly extraordinary. The morning mist clung to the wooden rooftops of Draugstad like memories that refused to fade. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys as the village stirred to life, fishermen preparing their nets while farmers loaded their carts with winter grain. The scent of baking bread mixed with the salt air from the fjord, creating the familiar comfort that had defined this place for generations. In the center of it all sat a modest stone house with a red-painted door, its windows dark despite the climbing sun. This was where Torsten the Fell-Handed spent his days, hidden from the world that once celebrated his name. The villagers knew his story well. How could they forget? 5 winters passed, when the fierce raiders from the eastern settlements had swept down like wolves upon their shores. It was Torsten who had led the defense. His massive frame had been unmistakable on the battlefield, his legendary axe Bone Crusher singing through the air as he carved through enemy lines. They called him the Fell-Handed because death followed in his wake, swift and certain as winter itself. But the battle that saved Draugstad had broken their hero. When the smoke cleared and the enemy ships fled burning into the night, Torsten lay crumpled among the fallen, his legs crushed beneath a fallen watchtower. The healers had done what they could, but some wounds, they said, were beyond mortal skill to mend. Now that same hero sat in a chair carved from oak and fitted with iron wheels, his powerful hands gripping the rims as he moved himself from room to room in endless, quiet circles. His legs, once strong as tree trunks, lay still beneath woolen blankets, as lifeless as driftwood on a winter shore. The people of Draugstad respected his sacrifice, but they also kept their distance. There was something unsettling about seeing a giant brought low, something that made them question their own mortality. They left offerings of food and coin outside his door, but few dared to knock. Those who did found a man who spoke in grunts and gestures, his eyes holding depths of pain that made conversation feel like trespassing on sacred ground. This was the world that Alfrid entered on a crisp morning when autumn was giving way to winter's grip. She had travelled from the mountain village of Helmsgard, where her own story had ended in ways she preferred not to discuss. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to bear weight without complaint. Her auburn hair was always neatly braided, her green eyes observant but kind, and her hands, those hands that had once tended to her own family's needs, were steady and gentle. The village elder, Astrid, had arranged for her employment. Astrid was a woman whose silver hair and lined face spoke of decades spent managing the concerns of others, and she had grown worried about Torsten's isolation. "He needs someone who won't pity him," Astrid had explained as she led Alfrid through the village streets. "The last 3 maids quit within a month. They couldn't bear his silence, or the way he stares at his axe hanging on the wall." That axe, Bone Crusher, was indeed mounted prominently in Torsten's main room, though dust had gathered on its blade like snow on a forgotten grave. The weapon was nearly as tall as a man, its handle worn smooth by countless battles, its head still sharp despite years of neglect. It seemed to watch over the room with the presence of a sleeping wolf, dangerous even in rest. Alfrid's first impression of Torsten was of controlled power barely contained. Even seated, he towered over most men, his shoulders broad as a doorway, his beard thick and copper-red with streaks of early silver. His hands, when he gripped the wheels of his chair, showed the calluses of someone who had spent decades wielding weapons and working with his strength. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue like winter ice, holding depths of intelligence that the villagers seemed to have forgotten. This was not a broken man wallowing in self-pity. This was someone choosing to remain hidden. "I'm Alfrid," she said simply, setting down her traveling pack. "I'm here to help with whatever you need." Torsten studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. Most people couldn't meet his eyes for more than a few seconds, but Alfrid held his stare with calm patience. Finally, he nodded once and turned his chair toward the kitchen. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, with rooms that spoke of a man who had once lived boldly. The main hall could have hosted a dozen guests around its long table, though dust now covered the carved chairs. Weapons and trophies from countless campaigns decorated the walls, shields bearing unfamiliar crests, drinking horns mounted in silver, and tapestries depicting scenes of valor that seemed to mock their owner's current state. Alfrid began her work without fanfare, cleaning and organizing with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing a household. She noted how Torsten positioned himself throughout the day, always near windows where he could watch the village paths. She observed the careful way he maneuvered his chair, never once bumping into furniture or misjudging distances. For someone supposedly helpless, he moved with remarkable precision. During her first week, she learned his routines. He woke before dawn and spent an hour staring out at the fjord, his jaw working as if chewing on thoughts too bitter to swallow. He ate little, picking at the meals she prepared with the distraction of someone whose mind was always elsewhere. In the afternoons, he would sit before his axe, sometimes for hours, his hands opening and closing as if remembering their purpose. But it was during the quiet moments that Alfrid saw what others missed. When Torsten thought no one was watching, his left foot would tap against the chair's footrest in rhythm with his thoughts. When he reached for items on high shelves, both legs would shift slightly, his body instinctively trying to help with the movement. And late one evening, when she glimpsed him through a partially open door, she saw him massage his thighs with the care of someone working out stiffness, not the futile gestures of a man trying to feel dead flesh. The revelation crept over her slowly, like dawn breaking through winter clouds. Torsten the Fell-Handed was not crippled, he was hiding. The question that kept her awake at night was why. What could drive a man to give up everything that defined him? What fear could be powerful enough to make a legendary warrior choose the shame of helplessness over the honor of standing tall? She began to watch more carefully, noting the way his breathing changed when riders passed on the main road, how his hands would clench when conversations drifted through the windows about strangers seen near the village borders. There was something or someone that Torsten feared more than the loss of his reputation. The other villagers spoke of him with the same tone they might use for a beloved dog that had grown too old and infirm to hunt. Eric the blacksmith would nod sadly when Torsten's name arose. "Tragedy," he would mutter, hammering out horseshoes with more force than necessary. A man like that, reduced to sitting in corners. Better to die in battle than live half a life. But Margit the baker, whose husband had fallen in the same battle that claimed Torsten's mobility, held a different view. "Pain changes people," she would say while kneading dough with weathered hands. "Sometimes the bravest thing is learning to live with what you can't change." Only Astrid seemed to suspect that there might be more to Torsten's condition than met the eye. The village elder would sometimes pause outside his door on her rounds, tilting her head as if listening for sounds that didn't quite fit the story everyone had accepted. Alfrid found herself caught between the competing versions of truth that surrounded Torsten's life. The official story hero broken in battle, legs destroyed, reduced to a shadow of his former self, felt as carefully constructed as any saga told around winter fires. But the evidence of her own eyes suggested a different tale, one where a man had chosen to disappear rather than face whatever darkness haunted him. As her second week began, she decided to test her theory. While cleaning near his chair, she deliberately dropped a heavy iron pot. The crash echoed through the house like thunder, and in that instant, before conscious thought could intervene, both of Torsten's legs jerked upward in a reflexive response to the sudden noise. Their eyes met in that moment, his wide with shock at his betrayal by his own body, hers steady with understanding. The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of a secret finally exposed. "Your legs work," she said quietly, her voice holding no accusation, only simple recognition of truth. Torsten's massive frame seemed to collapse inward, the careful facade he had maintained for 5 winters cracking like ice in spring thaw. His hands gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white, and for a moment she thought he might speak, might finally release the words he had held prisoner for so long. Instead, he turned his chair toward the wall, presenting her with his back as effectively as any door slammed shut. But Alfrid had seen enough. Whatever war raged within Torsten's heart was far from over, and the battle lines were drawn not across some distant field, but through the center of his own soul. She understood now that his greatest enemy was not the injury everyone believed had broken him. It was the fear that kept him voluntarily bound to his chair of oak and iron. That night, as wind from the fjord rattled the shutters and winter announced its approaching dominion, Alfrid made a decision that would change both their lives. She would not accept the lie that Torsten had built around himself. She would not pretend that a man capable of healing had chosen brokenness for any reason other than terror of something far worse than physical pain. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of helping him remember what it meant to stand tall. But first, she needed to understand what had driven him to his knees, not in body, but in spirit, and that, she suspected, would require courage from them both. The confrontation hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Torsten remained facing the wall, his broad shoulders rigid with the tension of a man whose deepest secret had been laid bare. Alfrid stood behind him, the dropped pot at her feet forgotten, her heart beating steadily as she waited for him to acknowledge what they both now knew to be true. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the sound of wind testing the shutters and the distant calls of fishermen returning from the morning nets. When Torsten finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of stones tumbling into a deep well. "You should leave this place," he said without turning. "Pack your things and return to whatever mountain village spawned you. Tell Astrid I have no need for a caretaker who sees too much." Alfrid bent to retrieve the pot, her movements deliberate and calm. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. "And you're not crippled." The words struck him like physical blows. His massive frame shuddered once, and when he spun his chair to face her, his pale eyes burned with something between fury and desperation. "You know nothing," he growled, his voice roughened by years of holding back truths that wanted to claw their way free. "Nothing of what I've lost, nothing of why I choose to sit in this chair, nothing of the price of standing when standing means—" He stopped himself, jaw clamping shut on words that threatened to spill secrets he wasn't ready to share. But in that moment of near confession, Alfrid saw past the anger to the terror beneath. This wasn't the rage of a proud man caught in deception. This was the desperate fear of someone who believed that truth meant death. "Tell me," she said, pulling a wooden stool close to his chair and sitting so their eyes were level. "Tell me what's so terrible that you'd rather live a lie than face it standing." For a heartbeat, she thought he might. His mouth opened, and something raw and vulnerable flickered across his features. But then his gaze shifted to the window, and whatever he saw there, or thought he saw, made him retreat behind the walls he'd built. "Leave," he repeated, but the command lacked conviction. "Leave before you." The sound of hoofbeats on the village road cut through his words like an axe through timber. Both their heads turned toward the window as the rhythm grew closer, not the familiar cadence of local horses, but the harder, more urgent beat of riders pushing their mounts at speed. Torsten's transformation was instantaneous and terrible. The colour drained from his face until his beard seemed to flame against skin pale as winter ice. His hands began to shake, the tremor starting in his fingers and spreading up his arms until his whole body quivered like a leaf in a storm. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Not yet. Not so soon." Alfrid moved to the window, pulling aside the woolen curtain to peer out at the main road. 3 riders had stopped at the village well, their horses foam-flecked and breathing hard. The men wore dark cloaks and spoke in low voices with urgent gestures, their faces shadowed beneath their hoods. "Who are they?" she asked. But Torsten had already turned his chair away, wheeling himself toward the back of the house with movements that spoke of panic barely held in check. "Traders," he said, his voice hollow. "Just traders passing through. Pay them no mind." But as Alfrid watched, one of the hooded figures pulled something from his saddlebags, a piece of parchment that he studied carefully before looking around the village square. His gaze lingered on several houses, including Torsten's, and she saw him point in their direction while speaking to his companions. These were not traders. When she turned back to find Torsten, she discovered him hunched over a wooden chest in the corner of his sleeping chamber, pulling out items with frantic urgency. Among them was a torn piece of parchment, its edges blackened as if someone had tried to burn it, but stopped short of complete destruction. "What is that?" she asked, but he crumpled the paper against his chest before she could see more than fragments of writing. "Nothing," he said, but his voice cracked like a boy's. "Old correspondence. Nothing important." The hoofbeats resumed outside, growing fainter as the riders moved on, but Torsten's terror didn't abate. If anything, it seemed to deepen, as if their departure was worse than their arrival would have been. "They're looking for you," Alfrid said. It wasn't a question. Torsten's laugh was bitter and broken. "Looking? No, they know exactly where I am. They've always known. The question is when they'll decide the time has come to collect what they're owed. What do they want?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one had to be wrestled from some deep place of pain. "My life," he said, "my death, my submission. Take your choice. The end result is the same." Alfrid knelt beside his chair, close enough to smell the fierce sweat on his skin, close enough to see the way his hands shook as they clutched the crumpled parchment. "What happened in that battle, Torsten? What really happened that made you choose this over standing and fighting?" His pale eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her stomach clench with sympathetic anguish. This was the look of a man who had survived when others, better men, perhaps had died. This was the face of someone drowning in guilt so deep that breathing felt like theft. "I lived," he said simply. "I lived when my brother in arms fell. I lived when the enemy leader put his blade to my friend's throat and offered a choice to serve his cause or watch everyone I cared about die slowly. I lived when I should have died with honor." The pieces began to fall into place in Alfrid's mind, like stones settling into a wall. The mysterious riders, the torn letter, the way Torsten flinched at any mention of strangers near the village borders. He wasn't hiding from injury or shame. He was hiding from an oath he'd been forced to make, a promise extracted under threat of massacre. "You agreed to serve them," she whispered. "I agreed to nothing," he said fiercely. "But I didn't refuse either. I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. I let them believe I might consider their offer while I planned my escape. But injured as I was, weak as I was, there was only one way to disappear completely. You convinced everyone you were crippled. I convinced everyone I was broken, useless, no threat to anyone, no value as a weapon or a leader, a man who can't walk, can't lead armies. A man who sits in a chair, poses no danger to anyone's plans for conquest." Alfrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind rattling the shutters. "But they're watching. They've always been watching." "Waiting," Torsten corrected. waiting to see if I recover, waiting to see if I remember what I was, waiting to see if the warrior will rise again and need to be dealt with permanently. The full scope of his trap became clear to her then. By pretending to be crippled, he had bought himself time and safety, but at the cost of becoming a prisoner in his own body. Every day he didn't walk was another day he remained invisible to his enemies. But every day he didn't walk was also another day he lost more of himself to the deception. "How long can you keep this up?" she asked. "As long as it takes," he said, but his voice held no conviction. "As long as they believe I'm no threat to their plans." "And what are their plans?" Torsten's jaw worked as if chewing something bitter. "To return," he said finally. "To finish what they started 5 winters ago. To take this village and every other settlement along the fjord. And when they do, they want me to stand with them, or at least not stand against them." The sound of voices outside made them both freeze. Someone was approaching the house, calling out in the cheerful tone of a friend making a social visit. But underneath the jovial words, Alfrid heard something else, the careful pronunciation of a man speaking a language not quite native to his tongue. Torsten's face went grey as stone. "They're here," he whispered. "They've come to remind me of my place." Before Alfrid could respond, a knock echoed through the house, 3 sharp raps, followed by 2 softer ones. Some kind of signal, she realized. A code between conspirators? "What do we do?" she whispered. Torsten closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they held the dead resignation of a man stepping onto a scaffold. "We pretend," he said. "We pretend I'm everything they think I am. And you pretend you see nothing, know nothing, suspect nothing. Your life depends on it now, too." The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and Alfrid realized that her simple desire to help a wounded man heal had just thrust her into the middle of a conflict far larger and more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. The door opened before they could reach it, and a man stepped inside without invitation. He was tall but lean, with dark hair streaked silver, and a smile cold as winter steel. "Torsten, my old friend," he said, his accent marking him as someone from the eastern settlements. "How good to see you looking so comfortable." Alfrid watched Torsten transform. The giant warrior seemed to shrink into his chair, shoulders rounding as he adopted the posture of defeat. His hands went limp on the armrests. "Magnus," Torsten said, voice flat and lifeless. "I wasn't expecting you. Weren't you?" Magnus moved through the room like he owned it, examining objects with casual interest. His gaze lingered on the dusty axe. "Strange. We've been in the area for days." "I don't keep track of village gossip anymore," Torsten replied. "Hard to care about such things when you can't walk." Magnus nodded sympathetically. "Such a tragedy. The great Torsten the Fell-Handed, reduced to wheels and wooden seats. Though you look remarkably healthy for an invalid. What else do I have to do but move myself around?" Torsten's laugh was bitter. 5 winters teaches a man to make the most of what little he has. "Indeed." Magnus picked up a wooden cup, turning it slowly. "And your mind? Still sharp? Still capable of remembering old conversations, old promises?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Alfrid felt her heartbeat quicken as she realized this was a test. Magnus had come to see if Torsten was still the man he remembered. "My memory isn't what it was," Torsten said carefully. "The injury affected more than just my legs." "How unfortunate." Magnus set down the cup and moved closer. "Perhaps I can help refresh your recollections. Do you remember our last conversation? On a battlefield, as I recall." Alfrid saw Torsten's knuckles whiten as they gripped his armrests. "I remember pain. I remember darkness. I remember waking up here, unable to feel anything below my waist." "Yes, the injury was severe." Magnus crouched beside the chair. "But injuries heal, don't they? Sometimes in ways that surprise everyone." The silence stretched taut between them. Alfrid forced herself to keep cleaning, though her hands wanted to shake. Not all injuries heal, Torsten said finally. Some things once broken stay broken. Magnus studied him, then smiled a predator's expression. Of course. How foolish of me to suggest otherwise. He stood and walked to the window. This is a prosperous place. Good farmland, excellent harbour. The kind of settlement that could anchor a larger territory if properly guided. Draugstad has always governed itself, Torsten replied. People value safety above all else, Magnus corrected. Independence requires strength to maintain. Without strong leadership, even prosperous villages become vulnerable. Alfrid understood clearly enough. This was both threat and offer, submit or be destroyed. Fortunately, Magnus continued, Draugstad has enjoyed peace. No major raids, no territorial disputes. Of course, peace is fragile, easily broken. What do you want, Magnus? The question came out harsh, and Torsten quickly softened his tone. Forgive me, the pain makes me irritable. Concern for an old friend, Magnus said smoothly. I'm impressed by your acceptance of the situation. Lesser men might have raged, sought revenge, but you've shown wisdom in embracing your limitations. Rage accomplishes nothing when you're trapped in a chair. Exactly. Magnus moved toward the door, pausing beside Alfred's herb pouch. And what are these? Medicines? Alfred's throat went dry. The pouch contained healing herbs treatment that made no sense if his legs were truly dead. Pain remedies, Torsten said quickly, for headaches and to help with sleep. Magnus opened the pouch and inhaled. Willow bark for pain, chamomile for rest, but this he held up a bundle. Comfrey root, excellent for healing tissue and promoting circulation. Curious medicine for a man with dead legs. The silence felt like the moment before an avalanche. Alfrid held her breath. Magnus smiled and returned the herbs. But hope is often the last thing to die, isn't it? Even when healers say recovery is impossible, we try their remedies. Touching human optimism. He moved to the door. I'll be staying in the village for a few days. Perhaps we can speak again. There's so much to remember. After he left, the house felt hollow. Torsten stared at the closed door. He knows, he whispered. He suspects, and soon he'll know for certain. Alfrid approached his chair. What happens then? Serve them willingly, or die fighting them uselessly. She looked at the herb pouch, the dusty axe, the man who had chosen captivity. There has to be another way. I could learn to walk again, Torsten said quietly. But that path leads to war. Either way, this ends in blood. That evening, after Magnus had taken rooms at the village inn and darkness settled over Draugstad like a familiar blanket, Alfrid found Torsten staring at the cold hearth. His massive hands rested on a silver arm ring he'd pulled from the depths of his clothing. Chest a warrior's band, worked with intricate knotwork that caught the moonlight streaming through the window. Tell me about your friend, she said quietly, settling onto the wooden stool beside his chair. The one who died in the battle. Torsten's fingers traced the silver patterns without looking up. Bjorn Ironwill. We fought together for 15 years, shared ale and stories around 1,000 campfires. He was the closest thing to a brother I ever had. What happened to him? The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of guilt that had been festering for 5 winters. Magnus had him by the throat when I regained consciousness. The tower had fallen on my legs, pinning me beneath the timber, but I could see everything. Bjorn was bleeding from a dozen wounds, barely able to stand, but still defiant. Magnus pressed the blade deeper and spoke his terms. Torsten held up the arm ring, letting the silver catch what little light filtered through the shutters. Bjorn gave me this the night before that battle. Said, if anything happened to him, I should remember what it meant to fight for something greater than myself. And what did Magnus want? My service, my reputation, My knowledge of every defensive strategy, every weakness, every secret passage in a dozen settlements along the fjord. Torsten's jaw clenched. He said if I agreed to serve his cause when called upon, Bjorn would live. If I refused, he would gut him like a fish, and then start on the villagers we'd fought to protect. Alfrid felt her chest tighten. I said nothing, Torsten whispered. I lay there, trapped beneath the timber, watching my best friend bleed while I wrestled with a choice no man should have to make. Serve the enemy and betray everything I believed in, or watch innocent people die for my principles. What did you do? Torsten's laugh was broken and bitter. I fainted. The pain, the blood loss, the impossible choice my body made, the decision my mind couldn't. When I woke 3 days later, Bjorn was dead, Magnus was gone, and everyone believed my legs were crushed beyond healing. The silver arm ring seemed to grow heavier in his hands. I let them believe it. Let them think I was broken, useless. It was easier than admitting the truth that I was a coward who couldn't even stay conscious long enough to save his best friend's life. You weren't a coward, Alfrid said firmly. You were injured and overwhelmed. No one could have made that choice under those circumstances. Bjorn could have, Torsten replied. Bjorn would have found a way to save everyone without compromise. That's the man I used to be, before fear made me weak. Alfrid reached out and touched the arm ring, her fingers brushing against his. Tell me about before. Tell me who you were when you wore this. For the first time since Magnus's visit, something like warmth flickered in Torsten's pale eyes. We were young then, full of fire and certainty. We believed strength could solve any problem, that honor mattered more than survival. Bjorn and I would charge into battles that wiser men avoided, come out laughing and bloodied and alive. You saved this village, she reminded him. Everyone knows that. The battle was won. The battle was won, but the war, the larger war Magnus is planning, that's still coming. And when it arrives, I'll be sitting in this chair while better men than me die trying to hold what I'm too broken to defend. Alfrid studied his face in the dim light, seeing past the guilt and self-recrimination to the man underneath. You're not broken, Torsten. Hurt, yes. Afraid, certainly, but not broken. Then why can't I stand? The question came out harsh and desperate. Why do my legs shake when I try to bear weight? Why does every instinct tell me to stay hidden when honor demands I face my enemies? Because healing takes time, she said simply, and because sometimes the deepest wounds aren't in our bodies, they're in our hearts. She stood and moved to the kitchen, returning with a small cloth bundle. I want to try something, if you'll let me. But you have to trust me. Torsten eyed the bundle suspiciously. What is it? Exercises, she said. Gentle movements to help restore feeling and strength to legs that have been still too long. My grandmother was a healer in Helmsgard. She taught me that muscles remember how to work, even after injury, if you give them the chance. My legs aren't injured, Torsten protested. They're scared, Alfrid interrupted, just like the rest of you, but fear can be overcome, one small step at a time. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal several leather straps and small weights. We start slowly, just moving your feet, flexing your toes, reminding your body that it still belongs to you. Torsten stared at the simple apparatus as if it were some fearsome weapon. If Magnus discovers I'm trying to recover, then we make sure he doesn't discover it, Alfrid said. We work at night, in private, when the village sleeps. Small movements, careful progress, nothing that would show to casual observation. And if it doesn't work, if my body truly has forgotten how to stand? Alfrid knelt beside his chair and began to carefully remove his boots. Then, at least we'll know we tried. But I've seen the way your legs move when you think no one is watching. They remember, Torsten. They're just waiting for permission to be strong again. As she began the gentle manipulations her grandmother had taught her, working the joints and muscles with patient care, she told him about her own losses, the family she'd left behind in Helmsgard, The reasons she'd sought work so far from home. "I had a husband once," she said quietly, her hands moving in practiced rhythms along his calves. "A good man who believed in protecting others, like you. He died defending our village from raiders not so different from Magnus and his people." "I'm sorry," Torsten said, and she heard genuine compassion in his voice. "I blamed myself for a long time," she continued. "Thought if I'd been stronger, smarter, braver, I could have saved him. But grief and guilt are poor teachers. They tell us we're weak when we're actually just human." As she worked, she felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease, felt the tremor of strength returning to limbs that had been still too long. But more importantly, she saw something shift in his expression, a gradual softening of the rigid control he'd maintained for so long. "The exercises will help," she said as she secured the final strap. "But the real healing starts when you forgive yourself for being mortal." Torsten flexed his foot experimentally, surprise flickering across his features as the movement came easier than expected. "How long?" he asked. "How long before I might be able to stand?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know this sitting in that chair hasn't kept you safe. It's only delayed the confrontation that's been waiting for you since the day Bjorn died." Outside, wind rattled the shutters like restless spirits seeking entry. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their deception. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his home, a giant warrior began the long journey back to his feet and to the courage that fear had stolen from him. 3 days passed before Magnus made his next move. During that time, Alfrid and Torsten had fallen into a careful routine, public displays of his helplessness during daylight hours, followed by secret therapy sessions when darkness provided cover. Each night brought small improvements, stronger muscle responses, better balance when he shifted weight, moments when his legs seemed to remember their purpose. But it was the carved wooden raven that changed everything. Alfrid found it on the doorstep one morning, no larger than her palm, but intricately detailed. The black wood gleamed with oil, and its eyes were tiny chips of amber that seemed to watch her with malevolent intelligence. She recognized it immediately from her grandmother's teachings, a death mark, a promise carved in wood and blessed with dark intentions. "Torsten," she called quietly, backing away from the threshold, "you need to see this." He wheeled over, took one look at the raven, and his face went ashen. "Where did you find it?" "On the doorstep." "What does it mean?" Torsten's hands shook as he picked up the carving. "It means Magnus is done waiting. This is a message he knows I'm pretending. He knows, and now he's giving me one last chance to choose sides willingly." "How could he know? We've been so careful." "Someone's been watching us," Torsten said grimly. "Someone saw the exercises, saw me moving my legs, or perhaps Magnus simply grew tired of playing games." As if summoned by their words, footsteps approached the door. But this time it wasn't Magnus who entered, it was Erik the blacksmith, his massive frame filling the doorway. The big man's usually cheerful expression was grave as he closed the door behind him and threw the bolt. "We need to talk," Erik said without preamble. "All of us, quickly, before those eastern bastards realize I'm here." Torsten studied the blacksmith with new wariness. "What do you want, Erik?" "To help you remember who you used to be before fear made you forget." Erik pulled a stool close to Torsten's chair and sat heavily. "I fought beside you in that battle 5 winters ago. I saw you fall beneath that timber, saw the blood, saw Magnus and his men standing over you like vultures. Then you know why I can't fight anymore," Torsten said quietly. "I know what I saw," Erik corrected, "and what I saw was a man with crushed ribs and a head wound, not broken legs. The healers said your legs were bruised but not crippled. So when you started claiming you couldn't walk, I wondered why." Alfrid felt the careful house of cards they'd built beginning to tremble. "You knew he was pretending?" "I suspected," Erik said. "But I didn't understand why until I saw Magnus yesterday talking to his men at the inn. I recognized one of them, a bastard named Ulf, who burned my cousin's farm 2 summers back. That's when I realized Torsten wasn't hiding from injury. He was hiding from them. Torsten's jaw worked as he considered how much truth to reveal. Magnus made an offer that night. Serve his cause or watch people die. I chose a third option, disappear entirely. And it worked for 5 winters, Eric acknowledged. But now they're back, and hiding isn't going to be enough anymore. They're not here just to check on you, Torsten. They're scouting for something bigger. What do you mean? Alfrid asked. Eric leaned forward, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. I've been listening to their conversations, watching their movements. They're mapping our defenses, counting our fighting men, measuring our weaknesses. This village is going to be attacked, probably within the next few weeks. How can you be certain? Because they've sent messages to other settlements, ravens flying east and south, carrying word to allies. This isn't just about forcing Torsten to choose sides anymore, this is about conquest. The wooden raven seemed to mock them from where it sat on the table, its amber eyes reflecting the morning light. Torsten picked it up again, turning it slowly in his massive hands. Even if you're right, he said finally, what do you expect me to do? I haven't held a weapon in 5 years. I haven't stood in battle formation, haven't led men into combat. They have armies, Eric. We have fishermen and farmers. We have you, Eric said firmly. Or we could, if you remembered what courage looks like. I remember what it costs, Torsten replied bitterly. I remember watching my best friend die because I couldn't make an impossible choice fast enough. Eric was quiet for a moment, then reached into his leather apron and pulled out something that made Torsten's breath catch a piece of metal, worked with the same intricate knotwork as the silver arm ring. But this was different, heavier, designed to be fitted to the haft of a weapon. Bjorn's axe head, Eric said simply, recovered from the battlefield after you were carried away. I've been keeping it safe, waiting for the day you might want to forge it to a new handle. Torsten stared at the metal as if it were a living thing. I can't. I'm not worthy to carry his memory into battle. Then what would make you worthy? Eric asked. Sitting in that chair while Magnus burns everything Bjorn died to protect? Watching from your window while the people of this village, your people, are slaughtered or enslaved? Alfrid saw the war playing out across Torsten's features, the battle between fear and duty that had defined his existence for 5 winters. But she also saw something else, a flicker of the man he'd been before grief and guilt had convinced him he was broken. The exercises are working, she said quietly. Each night he grows stronger. His legs remember how to bear weight, how to move with purpose. The body knows what the mind has tried to forget. Eric nodded approval. How long before he could stand in battle? I don't know, she admitted. But he's already standing when he thinks no one can see. The strength is there, it's the will that needs healing. Torsten held up the carved raven, studying its malevolent beauty. If Magnus suspects I'm recovering, he won't wait for me to choose. He'll force the issue, probably by threatening people I care about. Then we don't give him the chance, Eric said. We move first. We prepare the village for siege, we ready our defences, and we remind these eastern wolves that Draugstad has teeth. With what army? Torsten asked. We have perhaps 30 men of fighting age, most of whom have never seen real battle. We have something better than numbers, Eric replied. We have home ground, we have motivation, and if the gods are willing, we'll have you. Outside, clouds gathered over the fjord like an omen of the storm approaching. The carved raven seemed to grow heavier in Torsten's hands, a tangible reminder that choices delayed often became choices made for you. How long do we have? Torsten asked finally. Days, maybe a week, Eric said, but probably not longer. Torsten looked at Alfrid, at the therapy equipment they'd hidden so carefully, at the axe head that carried his dead friend's memory. Then we'd better get to work. The storm glass hanging in Torsten's window had turned dark blue overnight, its crystalline formations swirling like miniature tempests trapped in amber liquid. The ancient weather predictor had belonged to his grandfather, passed down through generations of seafaring warriors who understood that survival often depended on reading the signs nature provided. "Storm's coming," Alfrid observed, watching the glass with growing unease. "A bad one, by the look of it." Torsten nodded grimly. "Magnus will use the weather to his advantage. Strike when the village is battened down, when visibility is poor, and escape routes are blocked by wind and rain." It had been 2 days since Eric's revelation about the impending attack. 2 days of careful preparation disguised as routine village life. While Magnus and his men maintained their facade as travelling traders, sampling ale at the inn and making casual inquiries about local defences, the people of Draugstad quietly readied for war. The preparation had to be subtle, too obvious, and Magnus would know they'd discovered his plans, so fishing nets were mended with stronger rope that could serve as snares. Grain stores were moved to more defensible locations. Sharp tools found their way into strategic positions around the village, and at night, when darkness provided cover, selected villagers gathered in Eric's smithy to discuss tactics and share weapons. But it was Torsten's own transformation that provided the most hope and the greatest risk. Each evening's therapy sessions had grown more intensive under Alfrid's careful guidance. What began as simple flexing exercises had progressed to bearing weight, then taking tentative steps while gripping the walls for support. The muscle memory was returning faster than either had dared hope, years of warrior training reasserting itself as his body remembered its purpose. "Try again," Alfrid encouraged, steadying his elbow as he gripped the back of a wooden chair. "Don't think about Magnus, or the battle, or what might go wrong. Just feel your feet on the floor. Feel the strength in your legs." Torsten closed his eyes and shifted his weight forward. For a moment he wavered, muscles trembling with the effort of supporting his massive frame. Then something clicked into place, some deep integration of balance and strength that had been waiting 5 winters for permission to return, and he stood, not gripping the chair for balance, not leaning against the wall for support, but standing free and tall as he'd once stood on battlefields across the northern lands. "There," Alfrid whispered, tears of relief shining in her eyes. "There's the man who earned his legend." Torsten took a step, then another, moving with the careful deliberation of someone rediscovering forgotten skills. Each movement was measured, controlled, but undeniably strong. When he reached the wall where his battle-axe hung, gathering dust, he stopped and stared up at the weapon that had defined his identity for so many years. "I can walk," he said, wonder and fear warring in his voice. "I can actually walk." "You could always walk," Alfrid corrected gently. "Your body was never broken, only your confidence was damaged." Torsten reached up and touched the axe handle, his fingers tracing the worn leather wrapping. "Bone crusher," he murmured. "Old friend, have you been waiting for me?" The sound of footsteps outside made them both freeze. Torsten immediately dropped back into his wheeled chair, arranging the woolen blankets over his legs with practiced efficiency. By the time the soft knock came at the door, he was once again the picture of helpless invalidity. Alfrid opened the door to find young Astrid, not the village elder, but her granddaughter, standing in the drizzling rain. The girl was perhaps 16, with bright eyes and the kind of fearless curiosity that often led to trouble. "Begging your pardon," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "but grandmother sent me with a warning. Those traders at the inn, they've been asking questions about the old watchtowers, about how many men guard the harbour approach." "Come in, child," Torsten said, his voice carefully neutral. "No point standing in the rain." Young Astrid stepped inside, water dripping from her woolen cloak. "There's more. One of them was seen near the grain stores after dark, counting sacks and measuring doorways. And grandmother overheard them talking about something called the new moon tide." Torsten and Alfrid exchanged glances. The new moon tide would come in 3 days, the darkest night of the month, when attacking forces could approach by sea with minimal risk of early detection. "Tell your grandmother I'm grateful for the warning," Torsten said carefully. and tell her that an old warrior remembers more than people think, even when his legs won't carry him to battle. After the girl left, Torsten sat staring at the storm glass as its formations grew darker and more chaotic. 3 days, he said quietly. 3 days to prepare for war. Are you ready? Alfrid asked. Torsten considered the question seriously. My legs are getting stronger, but I'm not the warrior I was. 5 years of sitting in this chair have cost me speed, endurance, the fluid movements that kept me alive through 100 battles. I can walk, but can I fight? Can I lead men against an enemy who's had years to plan their assault? There's only one way to find out, Alfrid said, moving to the wall and carefully lifting down the great axe. The weapon was heavier than she'd expected, its balance designed for hands much larger than hers. She carried it to Torsten like a sacred offering. Bone crusher, she said, presenting the weapon to him handle first. Time to wake up. Torsten's hands trembled slightly as they closed around the familiar grip. The axe felt strange after so many years, heavier than memory suggested, yet perfectly balanced in ways his body recognized, even if his mind doubted. He stood slowly, testing his balance with the weapon's weight, feeling how it wanted to move in his grasp. The storm glass chose that moment to shift dramatically, its blue formations suddenly clearing to reveal the crystal transparency that predicted calm weather. Both Torsten and Alfrid stared at it in surprise. "The storm's passing?" she asked. "No," Torsten said, understanding flooding his voice. "The storm glass doesn't just predict weather, it responds to changes in the world around it. This means the balance is shifting. The time for hiding is over." He raised the axe experimentally, feeling how his muscles remembered the movements, even as his joints protested years of disuse. When he brought the weapon down, in a controlled arc, the whistle of displaced air sounded like a song of homecoming. "Magnus expects to face a village of farmers and fishermen," Torsten said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He expects no real resistance, no organized defense. What he doesn't expect is for the dead to rise and stand against him." Outside, the first drops of the promised storm began to fall, but inside the small stone house, a legend was remembering how to breathe. The carved raven still sat on the table, its amber eyes reflecting the firelight, but now it seemed less like a promise of death and more like a challenge waiting to be answered. 3 days, Torsten repeated, but this time his voice carried the iron certainty of a man who had found his purpose again. 3 days to remind these wolves that some sheep have very sharp teeth indeed. The attack came a day early. Torsten woke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through his window and the distant sound of screaming from the harbour district. For a moment, confusion clouded his thoughts. The new moontide wasn't until tomorrow night. Then understanding struck like a physical blow. Magnus had never intended to wait for the darkest night. The talk of new moontides had been misdirection, designed to give them false confidence in their timeline. "Alfrid," he called, struggling out of bed and reaching for his clothes. His legs felt strong beneath him now, the muscle memory fully restored after days of intensive exercises. But strength meant nothing if he was too late to use it. She appeared in the doorway, already dressed and carrying his battle gear. "The harbour's burning," she said grimly. "At least 6 ships, maybe more. They came in with the fishing fleet, disguised as traders until they were inside our defences." Torsten pulled on his leather jerkin with practiced efficiency, his hands moving through routines he'd thought forgotten. "How many men? Hard to tell in the darkness, but Eric estimates at least 100 warriors. They've taken the grain stores and are moving toward the village centre. And Magnus? Leading them personally. He's calling for you by name, Torsten, demanding that the great hero of Draugstad face him in single combat or watch the village burn." Torsten buckled his belt and reached for Bone Crusher, feeling the weapon's familiar weight settle into his grip like a missing piece of his soul returning home. "He's forcing my hand." making it impossible for me to remain hidden while innocent people die. That was always his plan, Alfrid said. From the moment he arrived, he's been maneuvering toward this confrontation. The question is whether you're ready for it. Before Torsten could answer, the door burst open, and young Astrid stumbled inside, her face streaked with soot and tears. "They have grandmother," she gasped, clutching her side where blood seeped through her torn dress. "Magnus grabbed her from the inn, said he'd trade her life for yours." Torsten's vision went red around the edges. Elder Astrid had been like a mother to him after his own parents died in a plague 20 winters past. The thought of her in Magnus's hands filled him with a rage so pure it burned away the last vestiges of fear that had kept him bound to his chair. "Where?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. "The old watchtower. He's got her chained to the beacon platform, visible to the whole village. Says if you don't show yourself by dawn, he'll—" The girl broke down, sobbing, unable to finish the threat. Torsten moved toward the door with the fluid grace of a man born to warfare, but Alfrid stepped into his path. "This is exactly what he wants," she warned. "You, alone and angry, walking into a trap with no plan beyond swinging that axe. Then what do you suggest? Let an innocent woman die while I cower in the shadows. I suggest you remember that you're not just a warrior anymore, you're a leader. And leaders think before they act." Torsten forced himself to stop, to breathe, to consider the situation with the tactical mind that had made him legendary. Magnus had orchestrated this perfectly, the early attack to catch them unprepared, the hostage to force Torsten into the open, the public challenge to strip away any possibility of retreat. But every trap had weaknesses if you knew how to look for them. "How many men does Eric have ready to fight?" he asked. 20, maybe 25, Alfrid replied. "Farmers and fishermen with more courage than experience." "And Magnus has 100 seasoned warriors," Torsten mused, "but they're spread throughout the village, busy with looting and intimidation. If we could concentrate our forces—" He moved to the window and studied the layout of Draugstad by the light of the burning harbour. The watchtower sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the fjord, accessible only by a narrow stone bridge that could easily be defended or turned into a killing ground for anyone foolish enough to approach alone. But as he watched, something caught his eye that made his breath catch in his throat, a flash of silver among the rocks below the tower, moving with the fluid stealth of someone trained in warfare. Then another figure, and another. Not Magnus's men, these moved like hunters, not pillagers. "There," he said, pointing. "Do you see them?" Alfrid squinted into the darkness. "I see shadows. What am I looking for?" "Reinforcements," Torsten said, a grim smile playing across his lips. "It seems we're not as alone as Magnus believes." The revelation hit him like a thunderbolt. The early attack, the perfectly orchestrated hostage situation, the overwhelming force, none of it made sense unless Magnus was working under pressure of his own. Someone had forced his hand, made him strike before he was truly ready. "Young Astrid," he said, turning to the injured girl. "When Magnus took your grandmother, did you hear him talking to his men? Any mention of other ships, other allies?" The girl wiped her nose and tried to think through her panic. He seemed angry about something, kept saying, "The timing is wrong, and this wasn't the plan." One of his captains mentioned ships from the northern settlements, but Magnus told him to shut his mouth. The pieces fell into place in Torsten's mind, like stones building a wall. Magnus hadn't come to Draugstad alone. He was part of a larger confederation, multiple groups of raiders planning simultaneous attacks along the fjord. But something had gone wrong with their coordination, forcing him to attack prematurely with insufficient forces. "The shadows below the tower," he said to Alfrid. "Those aren't Magnus's men. They're survivors from other villages, refugees who escaped similar attacks. Magnus is fighting a war on multiple fronts, and we're not his only target." "How does that help us?" Alfrid asked. "Because it means he's vulnerable. Torsten replied, his tactical mind racing through possibilities. He's committed most of his force to holding Draugstad, but he's exposed on his flanks. If those refugees are who I think they are. He moved to his equipment chest and pulled out a horn carved from walrus tusk, a battle signal used by Allied forces to coordinate attacks. If his suspicions were correct, there would be men positioned around the village who knew how to answer such a call. "This changes everything," he said, checking the horn for cracks. "Magnus expects me to come alone, driven by rage and desperation. Instead, I'm going to give him a war." "You're still walking into his trap," Alfrid pointed out. "Yes," Torsten agreed, "but I'm not walking into it alone, and I'm not walking into it blind." He tested the weight of his axe one more time, feeling the balance that had made it legendary. Magnus wants the great Torsten the Fell-Handed to face him in single combat. I think it's time to remind him why that name once made strong men wake, screaming from nightmares. Outside, the sounds of battle were growing closer as Magnus's raiders met the first organized resistance from Erik and his volunteer defenders. But the real battle, the one that would determine the fate of Draugstad and every settlement along the fjord, was about to begin at the watchtower, where an old woman sat chained to a beacon platform, waiting to see if the legends told about her village's greatest hero were true. Torsten raised the battle horn to his lips and blew 3 short blasts, followed by 2 long ones, the ancient signal that meant, "Rally to me, brothers, for tonight we ride to war." The sound echoed across the fjord like the voice of the gods themselves, and from the darkness around the village came answering calls that made Magnus's raiders pause in their looting to look up with sudden, terrible understanding. The dead hero of Draugstad was not only alive, he was calling in debts of honor that stretched across every settlement Magnus had thought to conquer. The trap had just become a battle, and the battle was about to become a reckoning. The response to Torsten's horn call was immediate and overwhelming. From the rocky shores around the fjord came answering signals, first 1, then 3, then a dozen warrior horns echoing across the water like thunder rolling through mountain valleys. The sound made Magnus's raiders stop their looting and look toward their leader with expressions that had shifted from confident aggression to nervous uncertainty. Torsten moved through the village with purposeful strides, his legs carrying him with the fluid grace of a man born to warfare. 5 winters of enforced stillness had cost him nothing that couldn't be quickly reclaimed, if anything. The years of hidden preparation had left him leaner and more focused than he'd been in his younger days. Each step toward the watchtower felt like another piece of his true self clicking back into place. Erik met him at the village center, the blacksmith's massive frame bloodied but unbowed. Behind him stood 23 men of Draugstad farmers, fishermen, craftsmen who had taken up arms to defend their homes. They looked at Torsten with expressions of awe and desperate hope, seeing in his upright stance the answer to prayers they'd barely dared to whisper. "The harbor district is secure," Erik reported, his voice carrying over the sounds of distant combat. "We lost 4 good men, but Magnus's advance force has been pushed back. The main body of raiders is regrouping near the grain stores." "And the watchtower?" Torsten asked, though he could see the distant glow of torches on the stone platform where Elder Alfrid was being held. 12 men guarding the approach, plus Magnus himself. He's making quite a show of it, wants the whole village to see him standing over his hostage. Torsten nodded grimly. "He's gambling that I'll come alone, driven by rage and the need to save an innocent woman. Classic strategy: isolate your enemy's leader, force them into making emotional rather than tactical decisions." "Will it work?" one of the younger defenders asked, fear evident in his voice. "It would have 5 winters ago," Torsten admitted. "The man I was then would have charged up that slope with his axe singing and his heart full of righteous fury. He would have died gloriously and accomplished nothing except giving Magnus the victory he needs to break our resistance." He looked around at the faces surrounding him, men who had chosen to stand and fight despite being outnumbered and outmatched. But I'm not that man anymore. Sitting in that chair taught me patience. Watching this village from my window taught me what's worth fighting for. And Alfrid taught me that healing sometimes requires accepting help from others. As if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from the darkness around the village perimeter. They moved with the disciplined silence of experienced warriors, their weapons glinting in the firelight as they took positions among Torsten's defenders. Their leader was a woman with iron-grey hair and scars that spoke of countless battles. Commander Sigrid of Helmsgard, whose reputation as a tactical genius was known throughout the northern settlements. "Torsten the Fell-Handed," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "When we heard Magnus's horn calling for single combat, we knew the rumors of your death were greatly exaggerated." "Sigrid," Torsten replied, clasping her forearm in the warrior's greeting. "I wasn't sure anyone would answer my call. Magnus has been raiding up and down the fjord for months," she said grimly. "Helmsgard, Ironhold, Crow's Landing, 7 settlements attacked, hundreds of people killed or enslaved. When we learned he was moving against Draugstad, we knew it was time to make our stand." "How many?" Eric asked. 47 seasoned fighters from 5 different villages," Sigrid replied. "All of us refugees from Magnus's earlier raids, all of us with scores to settle. We've been tracking his forces for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike." Torsten felt a surge of hope, tempered by tactical realism. 70 fighters against 100 was better odds than 23 against 100, but it was still a desperate gamble. Success would depend on coordination, timing, and the kind of inspired leadership that turned hopeless battles into legendary victories. "What's his disposition?" Torsten asked, falling naturally into the role of war leader that he'd thought buried forever. "Main force is concentrated around the grain stores," as Eric reported, Sigrid said, producing a rough map sketched on birch bark. "But he's got flanking forces here and here, positioned to cut off retreat routes. Classic hammer and anvil formation. He drives us against his strongest position while his flankers close the trap. Except he doesn't know about your people," Torsten mused, studying the tactical situation. "He thinks he's facing village militia, not a coordinated counterattack by experienced warriors." "The question is how to use that advantage," Sigrid said. "His position around the grain stores is strong, but it's also static. If we could draw him out—" "The watchtower," Torsten said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. "Magnus chose that position because it's visible to the entire village, because it forces me to come to him. But it's also isolated from his main force. If I challenge him there publicly, dramatically, his pride won't let him refuse." "You want to fight him alone?" Eric asked, incredulous. "No," Torsten replied, his mind racing through possibilities. "I want to make him think I'm fighting him alone. While I hold his attention on the tower, your forces hit his flankers. Sigrid's people take the grain stores from behind. By the time Magnus realizes what's happening, he'll be cut off from support with nowhere to run." Sigrid nodded slowly. "It could work. But you'd be taking an enormous risk if the timing is off. If he doesn't take the bait, you'll be facing him and his guards with no backup." "Then I'd better make sure the timing is perfect," Torsten said. He turned to Alfrid, who had been listening to the war council with growing alarm. "I need you to do something for me. Something dangerous." "Anything," she said without hesitation. "Get close to the watchtower, close enough to see Magnus and his guards clearly. When I give the signal, I need you to tell me exactly how many men are with him, how they're positioned, whether they look confident or nervous." "How will I signal you?" Torsten reached into his belt and pulled out a small hand-mirror polished metal that could reflect firelight across considerable distances. "Flash this 3 times when you're in position. After that, watch for my move toward the tower. The moment I step onto the stone bridge, that's when Sigrid's attack begins. And if something goes wrong?" Alfrid asked quietly. Then you run, Torsten said firmly. You run as fast and far as you can, and you don't look back. Promise me that. Before she could respond, young Astrid appeared at Eric's side, her wound roughly bandaged, but her eyes bright with desperate purpose. There's something else you need to know, she said. About grandmother, she's not just a hostage. Before they took her, she managed to send word to the other settlements. Magnus doesn't know it, but reinforcements are coming. How many? Sigrid asked. I don't know exactly, but grandmother has friends throughout the fjord region, traders, ship captains, mercenary companies. If even half of them answer her call, Torsten felt the tactical picture shift in their favor. Magnus had gambled everything on a quick victory before organized resistance could form, but his early attack had given them time to rally allies, and his choice of elder Astrid as a hostage had been a costly mistake. She was beloved throughout the region, and her capture would motivate fighters who might otherwise have remained neutral. When? Torsten asked. Dawn, young Astrid replied. Maybe sooner if the wind favors their ships. Torsten looked to the eastern horizon, where the first pale hints of coming morning were beginning to show. They had perhaps an hour before sunrise, maybe less. Time enough for a desperate gamble, but not for elaborate strategy. Then we do this now, he said, hefting Bone Crusher with renewed purpose. Magnus wants his single combat, and I'm going to give it to him, but while he's focused on settling old scores, we're going to destroy everything he's built. As the war council broke up and fighters moved to their assigned positions, Torsten found himself alone with Alfrid for what might be the last time. She helped him check his armor, straps and weapon harness with the careful attention of someone who understood that small details often determined the outcome of great battles. When this is over, she said quietly. What then? Then we rebuild, Torsten replied. We heal what can be healed, remember what should be remembered, and move forward together. And us? He looked at her, this woman who had seen through his deception, helped him remember his strength, and stood by him when the choice between courage and safety had to be made. If we survive this night, Alfrid, I'd like to find out what us might mean. She stood on her toes and kissed him softly, a gesture that carried all the hope and fear and love that couldn't be spoken aloud. When they separated, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Don't you dare die up there. Torsten the Fell-Handed, she said fiercely. I've worked too hard helping you remember how to live. As she disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness to take her position, Torsten gripped his axe and looked toward the watchtower, where an old woman waited in chains and an old enemy prepared for the confrontation that would determine the fate of every soul in Draugstad. The stone bridge leading to the watchtower stretched across a chasm carved by centuries of winter storms, its ancient blocks slick with sea spray and morning dew. Each step Torsten took echoed like thunder in the pre-dawn silence, announcing his approach to Magnus and the dozen guards who waited on the platform above. Elder Astrid hung suspended in chains from the beacon post, her silver hair whipping in the wind, but her eyes alert and defiant. Even from this distance, Torsten could see that Magnus had chosen his hostage. Well, she was positioned where any stray blow or moment of inattention could send her plummeting to the rocks below. Torsten the Fell-Handed. Magnus's voice carried clearly over the sound of waves crashing against stone. The dead hero walks. Tell me, old friend, how long have you been able to use those legs? Long enough, Torsten replied, continuing his steady advance across the bridge. With each step, he felt the tactical situation shifting around him. Behind him, invisible in the darkness, Sigrid's forces would be moving into position. Alfrid's signal mirror had flashed 3 times the agreed sign that she was ready to observe and coordinate. You disappoint me, Magnus called out, his tone carrying mock sadness. I had such hopes that your recovery was genuine, that the warrior I once respected had truly returned. But this, he gestured at the solitary figure approaching the tower. This is nothing but another deception. Where are your allies? Where is the great army that was supposed to save Draugstad? Torsten reached the end of the bridge and stepped onto the stone platform, Bone Crusher held ready in his hands. Up close, Magnus looked older than he remembered, harder, with new scars crossing his face and a brittleness around his eyes that spoke of too many battles fought for the wrong reasons. "I need no army to deal with you," Torsten said quietly. "Just this axe, and the memory of a friend you murdered while I lay helpless." Magnus laughed, drawing his own weapon, a long sword with a blackened blade that seemed to drink the torchlight. "Bjorn died because you were weak, because you chose to lose consciousness rather than make the choice I offered. His blood is on your hands, not mine." "Perhaps," Torsten agreed, beginning to circle the platform with the fluid movements of a predator seeking the best angle of attack. "But tonight, his death will have meaning. Tonight, the debt is paid in full." Around them, Magnus's guards formed a loose circle, their weapons drawn but their attention split between the two champions and the darkness beyond the torchlight. They were good fighters. Torsten could see veterans with the confidence that came from numerous victories. But they were also tired from a night of battle, and their formation was loose enough to exploit if the opportunity arose. "You know," Magnus said conversationally as they continued their deadly dance, "I never intended for things to come to this. The offer I made 5 winters ago was genuine, serve my cause, and Draugstad would have been spared. Your people would have lived in peace under my protection." "Your protection?" Torsten's voice carried all the contempt he felt for the man's twisted logic. "You mean slavery. You mean watching while raiders burned villages and enslaved children, all in service to your grand vision of conquest." "I mean order," Magnus snapped, his careful composure cracking for the first time. "I mean ending the cycle of petty warfare between settlements, creating something larger and more stable than these scattered villages could ever achieve alone. By force, by fear, by breaking anyone who refused to bow to your will. By any means necessary," Magnus replied coldly. "The world is changing, Torsten. The old ways, the codes of honor, the respect for individual choice, they're luxuries we can no longer afford. Only the strong will survive what's coming." Torsten stopped circling and faced his enemy directly, feeling the weight of Bone Crusher in his hands like an extension of his own will. "Then let's see which of us is stronger." The first exchange came without warning, Magnus lunging forward with a thrust aimed at Torsten's heart, only to find his blade turned aside by an axe head that moved like lightning despite its massive size. The ring of steel on steel echoed across the fjord, and suddenly both men were in motion, weapons weaving patterns of death in the flickering torchlight. Magnus fought with the fluid grace of a master swordsman, his blade darting in and out like a serpent's tongue, seeking the gaps in Torsten's defense. But Torsten's style was different, heavier, more deliberate, each swing of his axe carrying enough force to shatter bone if it connected. Where Magnus relied on speed and precision, Torsten used timing and power, turning aside attacks and countering with blows that would have been fatal if they'd found their mark. The guards watched in fascination as two legends tested each other's measure, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. But Torsten was fighting for more than victory. He was fighting for time, drawing out the combat until Sigrid's forces could complete their maneuvers. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the platform, came the sound he'd been waiting for, the clash of weapons and shouts of surprise as the coordinated attack began. Magnus's head turned involuntarily toward the noise, and in that moment of distraction, Torsten saw his chance. Bone Crusher sang through the air with the voice of vengeance, too long delayed. Magnus, caught off guard by the sounds of battle erupting throughout the village below, barely managed to bring his sword up in time to block the devastating overhead swing. The impact drove him to one knee, the stone platform cracking beneath his feet from the force of the blow. "Impossible," he gasped, his arms trembling from the shock of stopping an axe that carried the full weight of Torsten's fury behind it. "You've been sitting in a chair for 5 winters. You can't be this strong. Strength isn't just in the body. Torsten replied, pressing his attack with a series of crushing blows that drove Magnus steadily backward toward the edge of the platform. It's in the heart, it's in the reasons we fight, it's in the people we choose to protect. Around them, Magnus's guards were beginning to panic as the sounds of organized resistance reached their ears. What should have been a simple execution was turning into a coordinated assault, and their leader was clearly struggling against an opponent who should have been helpless. 3 of them moved to flank Torsten, but found their path blocked as dark shapes emerged from the shadows. Sigrid's advance scouts, who had climbed the cliff face while the attention was focused on the main bridge. Steel rang against steel as multiple combats erupted across the platform. Elder Alfrid, still chained to the beacon post, began working at her bonds with movements so subtle they were almost invisible. The old woman had not survived 63 winters by being helpless when circumstances required action. Magnus recovered his balance and launched a desperate counterattack, his blade weaving patterns of light as he sought to overwhelm Torsten with sheer speed. For a moment, it seemed to work. The giant warrior gave ground, his axe moving more defensively as he absorbed the fury of his opponent's assault. But those who knew Torsten's fighting style recognized the truth. He was drawing Magnus forward, letting the younger man expend his energy against a defense that gave just enough to prevent a killing blow while maintaining perfect position for a decisive counter. "You're tired," Torsten observed conversationally, even as his axe turned aside a thrust that would have opened his throat. 5 winters of easy victories against unprepared villages. You've forgotten what it feels like to fight someone who can fight back. "I've forgotten nothing," Magnus snarled, redoubling his efforts. But sweat was beginning to show on his face, and his breathing was becoming labored. The raid on Draugstad was supposed to have been a simple conquest, not a prolonged battle against a legendary warrior who had somehow returned from the dead. From the village below came the sound of horns, not Magnus's raiders calling for help, but the war songs of the northern settlements as reinforcements arrived with the dawn. Ship after ship was landing in the harbour, their crews adding to the growing force that was systematically dismantling Magnus's invasion. "Your confederacy is broken," Torsten said, allowing himself a fierce smile as he caught Magnus's blade on his axe head and twisted, nearly disarming his opponent. "Your allies are dead or scattered. Your grand vision of conquest dies here, on this platform, tonight." Magnus's response was a wordless scream of rage as he abandoned technique in favor of desperate fury. His sword became a blur of motion, seeking any opening, any weakness that might give him victory. But fury without discipline was just noise, and Torsten had spent 5 winters learning the discipline of patience. The end came suddenly. Magnus, overextended from a wild swing that Torsten had easily avoided, found himself facing the wrong direction as Bone Crusher swept around in a horizontal arc. The flat of the axe head struck him in the ribs with a sound like breaking timber, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing into the stone parapet that edged the platform. He lay there gasping, his sword fallen from nerveless fingers, his body curled around what were certainly several broken ribs. When he looked up at Torsten, his eyes held the stunned disbelief of a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered. "Finish it," he wheezed. "Make your victory complete." Torsten raised Bone Crusher, its blade gleaming in the torchlight. For a moment, the platform was silent except for the sound of wind and distant battle. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon. "No," he said quietly, "you'll live to see what you tried to destroy flourish without you. You'll live to know that fear and force are poor foundations for anything lasting." Behind him, Elder Alfrid had freed herself from her chains and stood with regal dignity despite her ordeal. Around the platform, the last of Magnus's guards were laying down their weapons in surrender as they realized their position was hopeless. From the harbour came the sound of celebration as the combined forces of 7 settlements secured their victory. The confederacy that had terrorized the fjord for months was broken, its leader defeated not by superior numbers or better weapons, but by a simple truth that Magnus had forgotten. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stand up for what they believe in, regardless of the cost. The age of hiding was over. The age of standing tall had begun. 6 months after the battle for Draugstad, the village had transformed beyond recognition. Where once there had been fear and isolation, now there was purpose and connection. Ships from allied settlements arrived weekly, carrying trade goods, skilled craftsmen, and news from across the northern fjords. The harbour that had burned during Magnus's attack now bustled with new docks and warehouses, symbols of prosperity built on foundations of mutual trust and cooperation. Torsten stood in the doorway of his home, no longer the modest stone dwelling of a man trying to disappear, but the expanded hall of someone who welcomed visitors and accepted responsibility. The wheeled chair that had defined his existence for 5 winters sat in a corner, now serving as a reminder rather than a prison. Sometimes village children would ask to sit in it, pretending to be the legendary warrior who had once hidden his strength. He would tell them that true strength wasn't in the body alone, but in the courage to stand up when standing up mattered most. Alfrid moved through the hall with quiet efficiency, her auburn hair now adorned with small silver braids that marked her status as the village healer. Her herb garden had expanded far beyond what was needed for one recovering warrior. Now it provided medicine for an entire network of settlements that looked to Draugstad for leadership and guidance. The healing skills her grandmother had taught her in the mountains had found new purpose in a world learning to rebuild after years of fear and conflict. The representatives from Ironhold arrived this morning, she said, approaching Torsten with the easy intimacy of partnership that had grown between them over the months of reconstruction. They're asking for advice on how to organize their own militia. Torsten nodded, his attention drawn to the silver arm ring that once again graced his bicep, Bjorn's ring, reclaimed from the depths of his shame and worn now as a promise to honor his friend's memory through actions rather than guilt. Tell them what we've learned here, that strength shared is strength multiplied, that fighting for others makes warriors out of farmers, while fighting for conquest makes monsters out of heroes. Through the window, they could see the village green, where Eric the blacksmith was training a group of young fighters in the fundamentals of combat. Not raiders preparing for conquest, but defenders, learning to protect what they'd built together. Eric's forge had become the center of an expanding network of craftsmen who shared techniques and materials, creating weapons and tools that bore the mark of cooperative excellence. Elder Astrid, fully recovered from her ordeal and more formidable than ever, approached from the direction of the rebuilt council hall. Her silver hair was crowned with a circlet of worked bronze, marking her new role as the elected speaker for the Northern Fjord Alliance. 7 settlements that had chosen cooperation over competition, mutual aid over isolation. The messenger from the southern kingdoms arrived, she announced, settling onto the bench beside Torsten's door with the satisfaction of someone whose long life had finally found its proper purpose. They're offering a formal treaty recognition of our alliance in exchange for trade agreements and mutual defense. And Magnus? Torsten asked, though he already suspected the answer. Still imprisoned in Ironhold, still convinced that we're all fools who will destroy ourselves through kindness and cooperation. Astrid's smile held no malice, only the patience of someone who had learned that some lessons could only be taught by time. Commander Sigrid reports that he spends his days writing manifestos about the inevitable return of strong leadership and natural hierarchy. Apparently, he believes our alliance will collapse within a year. Torsten considered this, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the handle of Bone Crusher, where it hung on the wall, no longer gathering dust, but ready for use if needed, polished and maintained as a tool, rather than worshipped as a symbol. Perhaps he's right that cooperation is more fragile than domination, but fragile doesn't mean weak. Sometimes the most beautiful things are also the most delicate, and the most worth protecting. The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the village green, where young Alfrid, fully healed and serving as an apprentice to her grandmother, was organizing a game that seemed to involve reenacting the Battle of the Watchtower with wooden swords and exaggerated heroics. The children playing the raiders always seemed to end up switching sides by the end, choosing to join the defenders rather than persist in villainy. "They don't understand what they're playing at," Alfrid observed, watching the mock battle with fond amusement. "Good," Torsten replied. "Let them play at war, without understanding its cost. That innocence is what we fought to preserve." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the fjord, painting the water gold and crimson, Torsten reflected on the journey that had brought him from a chair bound by fear to leadership earned through courage. The physical healing had been the easy part, muscles remembering their strength, legs learning again to bear weight. The real recovery had been learning to trust himself, to accept that wisdom could come from weakness as well as strength, that sometimes the greatest victory was choosing when not to fight. "Do you ever miss it?" Alfrid asked quietly, understanding without explanation that she meant the simplicity of hiding, the safety of being forgotten. Torsten considered the question seriously, watching as ships from 3 different settlements worked together to unload cargo in the harbour, as children played without fear in streets that had once echoed with screams, as his people prepared for a future built on hope rather than dominated by terror. "No," he said finally, his arms settling around her shoulders with the comfortable certainty of love that had grown from understanding and shared purpose. "I don't miss being afraid. I don't miss watching the world happen from behind windows. And I don't miss the man I was before I learned that true strength means being willing to be vulnerable for others." The storm glass in his window had remained crystal clear since the night of the battle, its ancient mechanisms somehow knowing that the greatest tempest had passed and calmer weather lay ahead. As darkness settled over Draugstad and lights began to twinkle in windows throughout the village, Torsten the Fell-Handed stood tall in his doorway, no longer hiding from his legend, but living up to it in ways that would have surprised the younger man who had once thought strength meant standing alone. The age of fear was over. The age of hope had begun.